How's it going, everybody? Welcome into the Skyline Sports Podcast. I am your host, Jack Hartman, joined, as always, by my good friend out there on the West Coast, my international traveling friend, just getting back from his trip to Costa Rica, Nick Normand. Nick, how you doing tonight, man?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Doing pretty dang well. I'm running on just about empty fuel right now, so I'm gonna try and keep my head in it, work through this podcast. It should be really good. But man, getting in at 2 a.m. last night and full day of work today. So 5 hours of sleep in the last 2 days. We'll see how it works right now. But
Yeah,
doing well, doing well. Vacation was great. I was still able to watch some NFL stuff, keep an eye on some college football stuff, and really happy to be back and really stoked to be talking with you, trying to keep up with the Joneses.
yeah. We took a week off while you were away, and when you're in the fall and you take a week off, that means 2 weeks of football happened between the last time that we recorded and now, and especially when we're still early in the season and teams have only played 4 or 5 games. Things develop and change quickly. We have a smaller sample size to grade from, and so with that being said, instead of doing like our normal winners and losers to try and reset ourselves, we're gonna talk about some teams that are exceeding our expectations and some teams that are failing our expectations. We each have quite a few. There's some overlap. There's some difference. But we'll start with those teams that are exceeding. My first one that I've got here is the Kansas City Chiefs. I knew that the Chiefs were going to be good this year. But like it's been definitely last year, and I feel like I remember the year before, there was some ironing out that the Chiefs needed to do in those first few weeks. And especially when I was looking at the beginning of their season where they went, what was it, Baltimore and then Cincinnati. I actually thought that they were going to start off 0-2 in the year. But you know what? They've hit the ground running. They didn't have any slip ups there. I mean, they had slip ups and stuff that they need to improve on, but they did it while still winning instead of doing it while losing. Obviously, the Rashee Rice injury that does not seem good. No one has confirmed what it is other than his knee. As a guy who had his knee hyperextended, rolled up on like that in high school, I would be surprised if he doesn't go on the IR at the very least. Let alone, who knows? There could be a lot of damage in there. So he might not be back for a while, which could change things. But the Chiefs are rolling, and they were rolling without Travis Kelce, basically non-existent for those first couple games. He got it going there against the Chargers this last week, but yeah, Kansas City looks good, like we knew they would. But they're doing it quicker than I was expecting.
I can get behind that, Jack. I can get behind it. I feel like Kansas City, back when Mahomes was first starting, they won very pretty with a lot of explosives and offense and everything. And this Kansas City team, at least in week one, with Worthy and with some of the additions, like they were doing stuff a little bit pretty, but now Worthy's cooled off a little bit. And now with the Rashee Rice injury, it feels like this offense doesn't quite have the juice. And yet, even without the juice, and even without as good of a defense, in my opinion, as last year, it feels like they can still win games even when they aren't the better team. It feels like they haven't been the better team multiple times this year, and yet they keep winning. And that's the mark of a great team, not a good team, a great team,
Mm-hmm.
to win when you're not as talented, not as good, which is opinion, but still. My first team that I really have exceeding expectations this year is a clear one, Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
Minnesota, the Vikings, I think that it's just a matter of the expectations that we were looking at with their rookie quarterback before he got injured. We were looking at this as a test year of like, okay, they have a rookie coming in who may or may not start immediately. And like, if they have like a 7-10 type year, that's completely okay. It's
Right.
just going to be growing pains. Like they just got off of Kirk Cousins. It's going to be a growing pains year. Their quarterback gets injured. Sam Darnold comes in. Sam Darnold's been balling out, had a couple of turnovers in the first couple
Yeah.
of weeks, a couple more than you might like. But he's been balling out, throwing a bunch of touchdowns, playing really efficient football for Sam Darnold and winning. And the defense has really taken a step up. And really, Brian Flores has gotten this defense to play together, to play tough. The additions they had in the offseason, just a really, really sound, really good overall team look the first month of the year. And I was not expecting a 4-0 start for the Vikings whatsoever, let alone a balanced 4-0 start for the Vikings, of the offense being really great and the defense looking really, really good. I just wouldn't have expected that out of this Vikings team. And yet they're overachieving my expectations. They're doing a really great job. And Sam Darnold, like, does he have an MVP case? He's Sam Darnold, but his numbers, the wins, like, it's looking kind of crazy. And the teams they're playing and beating is what's the most impressive thing to me thus far. The Giants week 1, like, the Giants aren't a good football team, but they dominated that game, and 28-6, I don't know that it was even that close. And then the 49ers that just never looked like they were in that game. The 49ers were down by multiple scores that game for most of the game, and yet they came back kind of late and made it closer. But that game was not close for most of the game, dominating the Texans, who we believe are probably a top 5 team in the AFC and a really good team. And then the Packers with Jordan Love, who threw a number of touchdowns and looked interesting, let's say, in the last week. But the Packers, a lot of people thought would be good. And so to beat really quality teams and pretty handedly too, that's really impressive to me. And the Vikings have been quite that, very impressive to me this season.
Yeah. I mean, through 4 games, I had Minnesota 1-3. The Giants, I had them beating them. But yeah, I mean, San Francisco, Houston, Green Bay is kind of an insane gauntlet.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think even if they went like 2-1 in those 3 games, I still would have been really, really impressed. But the fact that they won all 3 of them, granted, I've made it known on this program that I don't believe in Jordan Love the way the Packers believe in Jordan Love. But still, nonetheless, to go to Lambeau and beat the Packers the way they did, the game was not as close as the score let on. I think they were up. Were they up 31-0?
They were up 28-0, I think.
28-0, and then I think they were up 31-7. Yeah. And so, like they were doing their thing. Defense is obviously then playing a little bit more prevent, and things happened the way that they did in that one. But yeah, Minnesota looks really, really good. I could see Sam Darnold having sort of a similar arc to I'm trying to think, like Nick Foles, as he was sort of bouncing around as a backup in different places, got his shot in Philadelphia, and then all of a sudden, was getting paid a lot of money to be a starting quarterback in a few different places. He didn't do very well, but still, like this could be that for Sam Darnold. Like, he finally got a chance with competent coaching, with weapons, competent offensive line play, and a good defense. And he's like, okay, finally. I mean, I think about when his time in Carolina, he didn't look that bad. That sort of like started the whole resurrection of his career thing. I remember that the Lions were like on their hot streak there at the end of the season, and he kind of torched them. And the Lions were one win shy of making the playoffs that year, and it came down to that game. So he looks really, really solid. He's turned the ball over a little bit, but as opposed to when he was at the Jets and he was turning the ball over a little bit, but there was no way for him to make up for it by scoring touchdowns or by moving the ball. He's able to make a few mistakes here and there, but still be able to score points with the Vikings weapons, and it's paying off and paying in big dividends.
The hypothetical that's living in my head is like, what happens if the Vikings get to like 12 wins and Sam Darnold throws like 35, 40 touchdown, like some huge touchdown total too? Like, what do you do with him? What do you do with that? Like, are teams paying this dude $40+ million a year in free agency this year? Do they keep him when JJ McCarthy's there? Like, what do you if that's the reality that happens, what do you do?
Right.
I just it feels like it's like last year the Baker Mayfield kind of thing that happened. But imagine if Baker Mayfield did that with like a rookie hotshot QB on the bench. Like that,
Yeah.
it would just be a whole different vibe, I feel like.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing that's like interesting about this situation with Sam Darnold, you said like, does the team go and pay him 40 million? Probably not. But if he keeps it up the way he's playing now through the rest of the season, he technically will have a entire season of good quarterback play, as opposed to Jordan Love, who had 9 games of really good quarterback play, and he got paid what he got paid. Right now, obviously the situations were different. He's a first round draft pick, and they have to do the whole, are we going to franchise tag him thing? Are we going to pick him fifth year option? All of that. So I know that's a little different, but still, you look around the league, like, do the Raiders, like, do they go like, listen, we didn't get Michael Penix Jr. or Jaden Daniels, who are the 2 guys that we were kind of hoping to get. Why draft when we can go get him? Now, granted, I think he'll be another example of a Raiders quarterback that sucks, just because it's the Raiders. But I mean, there are other teams too, like what's Cleveland going to do next year? Deshaun Watson is playing like crap. With the newer allegations that have come out, they have a way out now in the contract to get out from under it. Do they go, yeah, you know what? Let's go sign Sam Darnold and see what we can do with him. So it'll be the Steelers. What do the Steelers do? Like, Justin Fields is playing great right now. And right now is playing like, no, I should be the guy. I should be the future here in Pittsburgh. But they just lost. Maybe that shakes his confidence a little bit. I hope not for his sake, because he still played, from what I could tell, a really good game, even though they didn't quite pull out the win, But maybe he kind of falls off and ends up kind of like hovering back down to average. Obviously, they're not going to re-sign Russ. Maybe the Steelers go and get Sam Darnold. So it could be really, really interesting looking at the landscape of starting quarterbacks in the NFL and where Sam Darnold fits into that next year.
Right. I completely get behind you. And if I remember, like, you're on the same page with me, right? That like this Vikings team has completely overachieved. I have them as a clear overachiever. And I'd assume you're
going into the season, I had them winning 4 games in the entire season. They've done that already. They would need to lose out to do that. Like, they're so far overachievers, the biggest in my book.
Right. I think this is one of the more impressive like teams that we've seen in the last decade in terms of our expectations to reality. Like, Texans last year with CJ Stroud was a shock. But like, besides that, in the last 5 to it doesn't come to mind for me. Like, what team went from like we didn't expect much of them to like exploding, looking like the best team in the league? Like, are we talking like the Eagles when Wentz turned into something and Foles finished the job? Like, Wentz still looked promising as a rookie, and that team was really talented. But like, what is it that the comp is for this Vikings team? What are we looking at here?
So. Yeah, and I feel like there are a lot of examples of that, of teams that like sneak into the playoffs and then do something. The 2 Eli Manning Giants teams that won the Super Bowl, like they were significant overachievers, just sneak into the playoffs as a wild card team, go to the Super Bowl and beat the Patriots. Especially the 2007 team that was playing against the 18-0 Tom Brady, Randy Moss, New England Patriots, right? But yeah, like you said, regular season, we don't really have that. Even the Texans from last year, I mean, they only went 10-7. Like, yes, they won the division. That just goes to show how bad the AFC South was. But like, it's not like they were scorched earth. They were looking like the greatest show on turf and were winning, and won 12 games, like. So yeah, I don't know right now. I mean, again, this is the perfect time in the NFL season for overreactions. We're 4 weeks in, which means we feel like we've seen enough to be able to make reactions, but in reality, things can change on a dime. So, speaking
Yeah.
of things changing on a dime, Tampa Bay is one of the teams that I have exceeding my expectations. Now, they made the divisional last year, the divisional round of the playoffs last year. They lost to my Lions in Detroit. It was a good game. Baker Mayfield resurrected his career last year. But I mean, they are 3-1. Their loss coming to Denver, which was super weird. I don't even know what to think about that. But they're 3-1, and they are leading the NFC South right now. Baker looks really, really good. He is utilizing Mike Evans. He is utilizing Chris Godwin. The running game looks great right now with Rashad White. Everything is just happening well, happening the right way. The defense looks a lot better than I was anticipating. I felt like, I mean, Todd Bowles is Todd Bowles, but I did feel like they lost a few guys that were a little surprising. How they're going to fill those gaps, but they look great. And so, yeah, I mean, I definitely have Tampa Bay as a team that is exceeding my expectations.
Mm-hmm. I can completely get behind that, Jack. I feel like Tampa Bay last year really hit their stride and hit their ceiling last year. And I didn't see what the ceiling above that was for this year. And yet they look better than they did last year. They just straight up do. Last year it was an NFC South that was who's the least trash in the garbage heap, who's the least awful in this division. And this year it's not who's least awful. Like this Falcons team, like we have expectations for the Falcons and Kirk Cousins. And the Saints have really looked good in this early part of the season. And Tampa Bay's looked just about as good as any of the rest of them and are fighting for their life, doing a great job. Baker's doing a really tremendous job quarterbacking. And really what I feel like they've won a couple of good games and like their offense has looked really good. But like their week 1 win this year was a 37-20 win over the Commanders. How does that look now that Jaden Daniels has like exploded into this?
I was just thinking
like,
the same thing.
Just in 2 to 3 weeks, he went from 20 points losing to Baker to leading the most deadly offense in the NFL, like just points on points on points, can't stop them for a drive, more point scoring drives than incompletions, like going from losing pretty handedly to Baker to that and your offense really blossoming into what it is now. I feel like the loss to the Broncos, as you said, is head scratching, but the wins have been quite impressive.
Oh yeah.
My working theory still with Baker Mayfield is that I just love the thought of him feasting on disasters, that his win last year in the playoffs against Philadelphia was him feasting on a disaster, a dumpster fire late in the season, that team fell apart. And when he got his first playoff win was against the Steelers, who were falling apart, the 11-0 Steelers that proceeded to lose 5 of their next 6 and really fell apart physically on defense, but also just completely lost the plot late in that season. He's really been feasting on disasters and more taking advantage of other teams looking bad and being bad. But this year, they're beating teams that aren't bad, that aren't looking bad. Like they beat the Lions in a straight up like head-to-head fight. They beat the Eagles, who are still struggling, of course, but they beat the Commanders as well handedly, who like the Commanders didn't look awful, but the Buccaneers outclassed them. And so I've been impressed with the Buccaneers and have them as clearly overachievers this year as well thus far.
Yeah, I feel like, clearly their resume is not as strong as Minnesota's. But, they aren't a team like, let's say, who could we talk about? They're not a team like Seattle, who started the season 3-0. They lost last night, so they're 3-1. But their wins were against Denver, New England, and Miami without Tua. Like they're again not Minnesota, but definitely higher up when it comes to the quality of their wins than some other teams.
Mm-hmm. I definitely agree with you there, Jack. Leading into who we were just talking about a little, the Washington Commanders are my next team that has clearly been overachieving what my expectations were.
Mm-hmm.
I completely fall in line with the group of people who thought Jaden Daniels could look really, really good early in his career, but the slight frame and the size, like he's 6'4" supposedly, and like that's a good height, but he's slender. He took cartoonish hits in college. But what's really impressed me is his accuracy, his ball placement, his arm, his ability to throw the ball. Like he's the dynamic rushing threat we thought he would be, but he's more polished and more developed as a passer than I think anybody thought he would be. And leading an offense that with running backs that aren't that impressive. Like I like Brian Robinson, but they're not that impressive.
Right.
Brian Robinson. And Terry McLaurin's good, but the rest of that receiving core is what it is. But like this offensive supporting cast isn't overwhelming by any stretch, and yet the points scored and the unguardability is absolutely ridiculous. And Jaden Daniels is the head of that snake that is causing many teams so much pain. So I definitely have them overachieving and looking like the best offense in the league, which like in the last couple of years they looked just not good as an overall team whatsoever. So looking like that to looking like this, it's just transformative via one player and having a winning record at this point and beating some solid teams at the very least. Very impressive.
Yeah, I definitely have Washington exceeding expectations. You're right, Jaden Daniels looks tremendous. After again, this is the perfect time to make overreactions, but if you look at what happened last year with the quarterbacks taken 1 and 2, and you look at the quarterbacks this year that have been taken 1 and 2, and even if you go back a couple of years to when the Lions took Aiden Hutchinson at 2 because Jacksonville took Trayvon Walker, it's
ridiculous.
over the last few years, it's looking a little bit better having the 2 pick, not the 1 pick, in terms of having guys that pan out. The other thing that I feel like we have to be on high alert at this point is that Davante Adams has requested a trade, and apparently the Raiders are looking for a second-round pick and a player. And if I am Washington, I am getting on the phone and I am talking and talking and talking until I get a deal done to get Davante Adams to Washington. Because the fact is, Jaden Daniels is doing this when his best receiver is Terry McLaurin, and his second best would have been Jahan Dotson, who they traded away. And if I'm being honest, and maybe this has to do with the fact that McLaurin hasn't had good quarterback play before this point, I would consider McLaurin a really, really top tier wide receiver 2 in the league. I'm not looking at him and, comparing him to AJ Brown, DK Metcalf, Amon-Ra St. Brown, George Pickens. Like I'm not putting him in that heavy, this guy is just going to eat you up wide receiver 1 place. So imagine if Jaden Daniels then has Davante Adams also. Apparently Davante Adams and the Raiders were hoping that Daniels would fall to them. Now imagine if Davante Adams gets to play with Jaden Daniels by getting traded to Washington instead. Who would have thought when he was leaving Green Bay, he's like, if someone told him, hey, you're going to go to Las Vegas, but within 2 years you're going to end up in Washington, he probably would be like, no, I'll just stay in Green Bay. That's fine, right? But it's the way things happen and the way the tide turns in the NFL.
Just while we have a moment here, speaking of Davante Adams and his trade request, are there any teams that have really stood out to you in terms of like where you'd like him to go, where you think he'd be a great fit? Anything particular like that you think are realistic? Just hit a couple right now that make sense to you.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I think Washington is definitely at the top of that list for me. I kind of like Indianapolis. I think it could be a good place for Anthony Richardson to have a target like that. I don't hate Michael Pittman, but again, he's not one of those like, no, this is a dude that is a killer, right? And so I think that could be a good place. I also am thinking about what it might look like for him to go to Arizona, to kind of mentor Marvin Harrison Jr. a little bit and be another guy there. Because honestly, like if I think about Arizona, I think Marvin Harrison Jr. I don't think I could name you another wide receiver that they have right now. So like that could be good and make things easier for Marvin Harrison Jr. having a guy like that on the other side of the field. Shoot, other teams. I mean, no, Green Bay's good with their young receivers, but could you imagine he goes back to
Going
Green
back
Bay?
there.
That would be
Just
wild.
just throwing a couple out there. I think the AFC East have a couple of good landing spots. I think the Jets going back with Aaron Rodgers in New York could make a good chunk of sense. I think the Jets having somebody opposite Garrett Wilson would make a whole ton of sense because we just saw this offense get blanked by the Broncos. They couldn't do anything against a Broncos defense that is good, but not great by any measure.
Right.
I think the Bills, it would make a lot of sense. We just saw the Bills offense get absolutely stopped as well against the Ravens. And it's not like the Ravens have an overwhelming defense, I would say.
Yeah.
I think the Patriots probably aren't in a position to make that investment, but would make a lot of sense as well in terms of they've always needed a receiver. Last 5 years, they haven't had anybody close to Adams. I think the Chiefs with their injury issues, it will make a ton of sense,
I was
but
just about to mention
within
that.
the division,
It would make the rest of the league sick.
it would be just the Chiefs would have to probably trade a first round pick and like overpay by a good chunk, I would say, to the Raiders for him. I think the Steelers opposite George Pickens, that like the Steelers have a bona fide wide receiver one to me and George Pickens. Like he's a wide receiver one, but they have no wide receiver two. They have a number of wide receiver 3-4s who like can do stuff, but they don't have that go-to slot route runner kind of guy right now. Maybe Roman Wilson out of Michigan can become that, but he hasn't played a snap this year thus far due to injury. But Colts, as you said, interesting. Jaguars starting off 0-4. I don't think you make that investment, but
No, I think that's a bad call.
I think that's a bad call organizationally. I think Trevor Lawrence would like it, but organizationally, I'd say that's a bad call too. So
And
I definitely say Pittsburgh Jets, Buffalo Chiefs would be very good fits to me.
Yeah, bad call organizationally for the Jaguars letting Calvin Ridley go. Like, oh, you got Gabe Davis. Like I don't get me wrong, I like Gabe Davis. I think he's a good receiver, but I think he got paid based on what he did in that playoff
game.
I don't know. I actually kind of think that Shakir is a better receiver for Josh Allen than Gabe Davis was. So but anyway, let's move on to some of the teams that we'd say are not meeting our expectations. And teams that we would say are sort of failing. Maybe they're not like super far below our expectations, but the expectations of everybody else, they're kind of down there. The team that I feel like I have to start talking about is the Miami Dolphins. There's obviously this huge asterisk about it with the Tua injury, but I mean, if we're being honest, when he was healthy, they didn't look great either. I think that I was sort of expecting this for Miami this year, that the fact that they had invested so much money in some of these guys and they didn't have money to go get other guys to keep bolstering the roster was going to catch up with them. I really, really think that we're seeing that right now. Again, the injury bug is just absolutely killing them, as it is killing everybody this time of year. I mean, I watched the Detroit Seattle last night, and Detroit had 5 guys that were out 5 starters that were out, and I think Seattle had like 7 starters that were out. Like it's that time of year where everybody's like, oh, we're just so injured, but no one has gotten to the point that it's like, yeah, everybody's injured, so we just deal with it. It's that weird in between, especially because bye weeks haven't happened yet. But yeah, Miami they just don't look good. Things don't look good. I don't know. I mean, you have Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle on opposite sides of the field, and you just can't move the ball. Like it's surprising, man. It just doesn't look. It just looks weird. It looks weird. It looks like Mike McDaniel doesn't really know what he's doing anymore, and he's like, shoot, I'm kind of like at this point, these guys' talent isn't enough, and like I've really got to go out and like be doing the thing that makes the difference. And it's like he's not entirely sure what that is. Like there's like, and it's not just the offense, it's the defense too. There's no reason that Tennessee should be scoring 31 points with Mason Rudolph as their quarterback, scoring 31 points against this team. Like that's just unacceptable, especially at their own place. Like it's just, yeah, Miami looks rough.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. Miami, with or without Tua, this team was primed to take a step back. They were one of my teams this last off season that it felt like there's no way that they're going to be where they were last year. And where they were last year was getting their butts handed to them in Arrowhead by the Chiefs in the playoffs in freezing cold weather.
Mm-hmm.
And there was nothing that I saw happen within the last 6 months or a year that made me think that anything will be any different this year than last year. And things have gotten worse. They've just gotten objectively worse. Offensively, defensively, they obviously aren't healthy on their defensive line with the injuries they sustained late last year. But the offense without Tua, we've seen the offense without Tua before in his career. And the offense with Tua wasn't looking great. And the offense without Tua is looking disastrous and looking like just varsity versus junior varsity players. It doesn't look right at all. And that's against a Titans team that nobody thought was any good, particularly this year. I thought the Titans could be interesting. I thought Will Levis could be more than he's been, but all he's been good for this year are just some dastardly turnovers and some pretty hilarious memes thus far through the first 4 weeks. And that's valuable to me, but not so valuable to my take aging well. So,
like, what does Miami do with Tua? Like this is going to sound crazy, but like, hear me out. For the last few years, me and another friend of mine, like we've joked about teams being in quarterback purgatory, right? Minnesota was in quarterback purgatory with Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins was an average quarterback that would play well enough that you weren't really going to lose games because of him, but wasn't going to be the guy that's like a Mahomes that you want to have the ball at the end of the game because he's going to go and he's going to make it happen. And they paid him all the money and they were just kind of stuck with him, right? I feel like Miami's kind of in that same boat. Like I don't want to speak ill of, Tua in light of his concussion issues, but outside of that, even when he's been healthy, like last year, like they didn't win the AFC East. They were playing away at Arrowhead, and Tua can't play. Tua cannot play in the cold. Like the statistics are there. It's not even like an opinion anymore, right? And when in November and December you're having to go to New England, to Buffalo, and to the Jets in your division, let alone then when if you're not winning the division and hosting a playoff game and you're going to Arrowhead or Buffalo again or Cincinnati, or Pittsburgh, right? Like you're just not going to be able to win those games while you have Tua right now. And you've invested all this money, and I think if you're the Dolphins, it's time to start to, like I mean I saw a joke last night that like the Dolphins look worse than they did in 2021 when they were intentionally tanking. Like, and they do, so like maybe it's time to get cheap, maybe as hard as it is, you trade one of those guys, one of those receivers. Try to get young and get cheap and acquire draft picks so that you can try and start this process all over again, because you had your window and you didn't even win a playoff game in your window. Like that's how I feel about the Dolphins. I don't want the sun to set, and like too quickly, but I feel like it's dusk, like it's there. So
It feels like, as you were saying with the quarterback purgatory analogy, that to me there's kind of a range of like the kind of top 10 to top 15 guys in the league. I feel like they occupy a space where I feel like if you're not soundly in the top 5 to 10 in the league, it's really, really hard to win a Super Bowl without one of those guys. Very difficult. But like there are guys like a Derek Carr on the Raiders, like they were still losing a number of games, but they weren't getting to like 1, 2, or 3 wins with Derek Carr. They were winning 4, 5, 6, 7 games with Derek Carr because he's just good enough. He's just good enough. Kirk Cousins, you're not going to win 2 or 3 or 4 games with Kirk Cousins at the helm, but you're not going to win 13, 14 games and win some playoff games. You might win those like 13 games because of fluky stuff and because your 1-score game margin is crazy, but then you're going to lose to the Giants.
Yeah.
Baker Mayfield, I think, falls into this range where thinking about Baker Mayfield with these Buccaneers winning a Super Bowl doesn't really fall into line for me. But Baker Mayfield leading a team to like 2, 3, 4 wins also just doesn't sound realistic. I think there are other dudes. I think there were stretches in Jimmy G's career. I think that Dak Prescott is the very high end of this, of like top 10, top 8-ish, maybe quarterback in the league. But I just don't view him with that contract to be able to do that. I think that Tua, as you said, I feel like Andy Dalton in his prime was very much that of like, no way he's winning a Super Bowl, but no way they're losing a million games.
Yeah. Geno Smith right now, I think, falls into that category really well.
Geno Smith, Ryan Tannehill with the Titans. The Titans were never going to win a Super Bowl with that team, but they were good enough to make things interesting, to make the playoffs, to do some cool stuff, but not to get over the hump. So, yeah, that range of quarterback purgatory, it's a messy place to be, but it can be really fun in that moment. It can be really fun. Derek Carr in a playoff game, slinging the ball, getting 10, 11 wins. It can be really fun. You can be Kirk Cousins, hucking the ball all around, 13 wins, like you feel high on your horse. But it sucks when you hit that playoff loss. It can be really fun being Andy Dalton, being a top 1 or 2 seed in the AFC. But man, like you know in your heart of hearts, like that's not the dude who's leading you to a Super Bowl. You know as a player. And so it's just a really tough place to be. When you have a Brady or a Mahomes or a Rodgers or an Allen, like you feel like you have a dude and you don't have that ceiling that you can't get above. Their ceiling is Super Bowl or bust. That's their ceiling always.
Yeah, I agree with you 100% there. I know the next team on your list is the next team on my list too, and that's Cincinnati. So Nick, start the conversation here about the Bengals.
Maybe the Bengals shouldn't be failing to reach expectations. We should expect at this point the Bengals to suck early in the season and get it together later in the season. It feels like that's how they always are. Mm-hmm. And it feels like Joe Burrow's health early in the seasons gets messy, and late in seasons can be messy too. But man, to be 1-3 at this point, and your only win to be against an Andy Dalton Panthers team, like, take solace in this. It's a win against an Andy Dalton Panthers team and not a Bryce Young Panthers team. If it was a Bryce Young Panthers team, you get 0 points of extra credit for that. For an Andy Dalton Panthers team, you get a little bit of brownie points. You get a few brownie points for that of like, okay, you beat a not worse team in the league type team. So I think they can take solace in that. But this Bengals team that I personally thought their defense last year played terribly, And it's had its moments against the Chiefs looking better, but to not be able to scratch together wins early in the season, and the defense has looked atrocious at times, particularly their corners really, really struggling. And really, the nails in the coffin, man, not being able to get a single stop whatsoever on the Commanders, losing to the Patriots week one.
Yeah.
Like, those are things on your resume that happened, and you can't take those off your resume. And those things, when you get to late in the season, like every win matters. In the NFL, it's not like baseball or basketball where like, okay, the Clippers, like they clearly are above all the play-in games and they're a 5 or 6 seed in the NBA the last couple of seasons. Like, okay, they're above the below teams that are struggling to make the playoffs, but they're below the top 5 teams. Like, if you're at 9 wins, you're fighting 3 or 4 other teams who also have 9 wins. If you've got 10 wins, you're fighting 2 or 3 other teams who have 10 wins. If you have 11 wins, you're wrestling with other teams who also have that many wins. You're fighting tooth and nail with teams you're tied with. And when you're going to be fighting against these teams late in the season in the AFC North, like they got Cowboys, they got the Browns defense, they got the Steelers twice later in the year. They have the Chargers, they got the Ravens later in the year, Eagles later in the year, Ravens again later in the year. Man, there just aren't quite as many wins as you want, but there are still clearly winnable games to come, with the Giants coming, with the Raiders coming to town, with the Titans going down to Tennessee. Like, there are wins to be had, but I don't know that you can get to 10 wins. I don't know that you can get to 11 wins. And that's what you need, not just to win the division, to make the playoffs in the AFC. Like, you kind of got to get up above that 10 win, around that 10 win threshold. And I don't know that they have the room for error that they've left themselves in this hole.
Yeah, they've shot themselves in the foot, and maybe they'll find a way, but eventually, I mean, if you're Joe Burrow and the Bengals, you have to be thinking like it would be really, really nice to get to week 16 and be locked into the playoffs, be locked into whatever seed we are, whether that is the 1 or whether Kansas City has the 1, and they're in the 2. But they can't get lower than the 2, and be able to like, all right, we're going to rest our guys, like, and they can't seem to find themselves in that because of the way they start their season. Now, this team, if they turn it around, they can win a lot of games. They can win a lot of those, tougher games too, not just, Denver, Tennessee, the Chargers, the Raiders, the Giants. Like, they can win some of those, Baltimore, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Dallas, Philadelphia, like they can win some of those games, but it doesn't look good to start. Staying in the AFC North, I also have Cleveland as a team that is nowhere near my expectations. Cleveland was a team that I had winning 11 games and being a wild card team. I also had them winning their first 4 games because their first 4 games were Dallas, who didn't do anything in the offseason to get better, Jacksonville, the Giants, and the Raiders. I didn't think that it was crazy to think that they were going to start off with 4 wins, yet here we are. They're 1-3. And unlike Cincinnati, like, they aren't a team that is historically like, well, we start slow and then we pick it up, So I see them losing to Washington in their next game. I see them losing to Philadelphia. They might beat Cincinnati just because Joe Burrow can't beat the Browns. They'll definitely lose to Baltimore. I think they'll lose to the Chargers. New Orleans, we'll see what New Orleans shows up. Is it week 1 and 2, or is it week 3 and 4? Pittsburgh, they never beat. They play Denver. They play Kansas City. They don't have the same, like, they lost their winnable games at the beginning of the year. That would mean they could afford to lose some of those harder games later and still be able to reach an 11-win threshold. And I just don't see that happening for them this year. Deshaun Watson has looked awful. They're another team that right now is in quarterback purgatory with him and the money that is tied to him. No one would touch him with a 39.5-foot pole. So it's not like they can trade him. Who in their right mind would trade for Deshaun Watson? Like the answer is nobody.
No.
So it's like, what do you do at the end of the year? Do you go the Denver with Russ route and you're just like, you know what? We're just going to cut you and we're going to eat that loss, but then at least you aren't here and we can try something else. I think if you're Kevin Stefanski, you have to think about it because like your job isn't on the line because you've made the playoffs a few times with the Browns and won playoff games with the Browns, which is, not easy. But still, like you did better with Joe Flacco than you did with Deshaun Watson. You did better with Baker Mayfield than you did with Deshaun Watson. So at what point is it like, all right, for the sake of my sanity and my job, we got to move on from this guy, So that's sort of where I'm at with Cleveland right now.
I also think you're kind of understating it a little. I don't know that with Deshaun Watson, they're in quarterback purgatory. They might be in quarterback hell right now.
Fair
in
enough.
Terms of like, this isn't purgatory. This isn't you're winning just enough games. This isn't just good enough to like do some good things. I think he's like bad enough to be losing you games that like if they had competent quarterback play, like do they win 10, 11, 12 games like last year? I think he's not the quarterback purgatory like level of good. I think they trade him for Kirk Cousins, like quarterback purgatory Kirk Cousins in an instant, in a second. And I think that just indicates to me like they're in hell. They're not in purgatory. They are in last year, the Broncos having to cut Russell Wilson for nothing. And it just shows that they screwed themselves over. Like they're in that position, if not worse.
Yep.
And I think they're probably in a worse position because I think their team's better than that Broncos team. I think their team has so much talent on the defense. The offensive line historically has been quite good. The running game, Nick Chubb. They obviously took a step back with the Chubb injury and with their offensive line coach leaving. But man, where this team was at last year, if they had competent quarterback play last year, I think that team was primed to like, if you put Kirk Cousins on that Browns team all of last year and he was healthy, why can't they be a 12 or 13 win team last year? There was if you have healthy Nick Chubb, healthy Kirk Cousins, middle of the road Kirk Cousins, top 10 borderline Kirk Cousins, that team I think would be able to wrestle the Chiefs on their best day. Easily would be able to fight them tooth and nail.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they beat San Francisco with PJ Walker as their quarterback last year, right? Like, yeah. And granted, that defense has taken a step back. Not a huge step back, and it doesn't help when your offense isn't scoring any points, and so you're required to win a game to hold your opponent to like 13 points. But you also do have to wonder, like Jim Schwartz, his name didn't go around really, as far as we knew, in coaching cycles last year, but it might this year. I mean, we all know that Carolina's head coaching position is going to be available because that's a revolving door. It'll probably be available in 2 weeks. There are other teams that are probably going to be looking to upgrade at coach as well, and you have to think, how long does he stick around to do that, or stick around as the defensive coordinator? You mentioned Brian Flores earlier. He is like by far the number one lead candidate right now. Probably him and Ben Johnson from Detroit are the top two candidates for whatever positions are going to be open next year. But yeah, it's not looking good in Cleveland.
Right. Just again, pondering the reality, imagine if the Browns had gotten that prime Deshaun Watson who was on that Texans team. If they had gotten prime Deshaun Watson last year, at the end of the year before, I don't see why they're not the best team in football. If you got that top 5 quarterback Deshaun Watson on that team, they are clearly able to throw a punch with the Chiefs. to be able to throw a punch with the Niners. Clearly, we saw them beat the Niners last year.
Yeah.
That team with prime Deshaun Watson, if they got what they paid for, they would be unbelievable. They would have a ring on their finger. And they don't, and they're not close now. Their window opened and closed like that.
Yeah.
And was it really ever opened? Because the investment was never going to work out, seemingly. But if it had, if that reality didn't vanish in front of their eyes, the Cleveland Browns would have a ring right now.
Yeah. I think, and this will sort of be the bow on the Browns, but we talk about the biggest busts in NFL history, and we talk about draft picks, but the trade that the Browns made for Deshaun Watson, considering how much they gave up and what they gave up turned into. I mean, we're looking at the Texans now as a legitimate contender in the AFC, and a lot of that had to do with the draft picks that the Browns gave up. You know, the money that is now invested in Deshaun Watson, the picks that were invested to get him, and what those picks turned into. I mean, I think that the Browns trade for Deshaun Watson is probably like the biggest bust in NFL history. Just
right.
Yeah, there's no other way to put it.
What makes it even more unbelievable is that trade seems clearly to be one of the 2 or 3 clearly worst trades in NFL history. And Russell Wilson being traded to the Broncos happened at the same time.
Yeah.
Probably one of the 2 or 3 worst trades in NFL history as well, at least in the last 50 years.
Yeah.
In the last 50 years since the Super Bowl started, and in a 1-year time span, we saw 2 huge quarterback trades that turned into disasters overnight, it seems like.
Mm-hmm.
And that's unbelievable. Because I think the Broncos, we'd be talking about the Broncos situation as a disaster way more if what happened with the Browns never happened. We'd say they just nuked their team.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just not viewed quite that way, but it's 2 trades that blew up in one team's face and set the other team up for great success.
Yeah.
And that's an absolute disaster. As a team, it takes years to recover from, and we're seeing it in real time.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yes, sir. My last team in terms of failing teams, we brought it up a little before. I don't have much to say. Titans with Will Levis. As I said before, he's good for a meme every week. He's good for a very clippable disaster, hands on the face, being mown over by a defensive lineman, just looking absolutely goofy on the sideline. He's worth every penny for the box office, but for all the wrong reasons. And I didn't see any reason why he should have been worse than he was last year, and he's looked objectively worse. And if not worse, he might be a bottom 2 quarterback in the league. Like Bryce Young when he was playing, and Will Levis is right there. And I didn't expect that out of him, and that's what he is. And that's the reason the Titans are where they're at. Their defense has played admirably at times. Their offense has talent, and they're 1-3 is what it is. Or 2-2? Or did they get us? They beat the Dolphins, I think, 1-3.
1-3.
I believe.
1-3.
1-3.
Yeah, they lost to Chicago. They lost to Chicago. They lost to the Jets. They lost to the Packers.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's on Levis. That's on him. That's all I really have to say.
Yeah. The other team that is not failing my expectations for them, but I know is failing your expectations for them because you had them as a playoff team, is Trevor Lawrence and the Jacksonville Jaguars. I had them going 7-10 this year, and I had them losing their first 4 games because you looked at it and it was Miami, Cleveland, Buffalo, Houston. That isn't an easy first 4-game stretch. But it would be different if they were losing those games admirably, and they have not. They have looked like the bottom of bottom feeders in the NFL. Trevor Lawrence just does not look very good. He doesn't really have great weapons right now. It was a travesty that Jacksonville, after the connection that Lawrence had with Calvin Ridley, that they let him walk. I don't think that was good for him. You look at the team, you're like, who does he have? He has Evan Engram, and
Rookie Brian Thomas.
Rookie Brian Thomas, Christian Kirk, Gabe Davis.
ETN struggled in the backfield.
Yeah, it's not looking great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you. This Jacksonville team, in retrospect, this Jacksonville team the last year and a half has completely paralleled this Eagles team. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to bring them up as underachieving, but they have. But both these teams were dominant and looked really good early last season, and mid-late last season fell apart, and the vibes were awful, and everything seems to have melted in front of your eyes. And the quarterback play on both teams is part of the issue, if not the bigger part. But I just think about it like, hey, if Trevor Lawrence was on this Eagles team, would they be better? If Jalen Hurts was on this Jaguars team, like, where would they be at? But the parallel's there, and it seems like the timing just makes it look similar to me. But both of these teams, I feel like just the vibes are awful. It seems like everybody's waiting to fire the coach it seems like the owners would be ready to fire the coach right now on both of these teams. It just feels inevitable and bad vibes all around. And so that's really all I got. It really feels like the match is lit. It's just putting match to gasoline at this point. It's whether it's now or a month from now or end of the season.
Yeah, it's not pretty. It's especially not pretty considering. Well, I mean, like let's just stop and think about Tua, Jordan Love, Trevor Lawrence, Joe Burrow, Jared Goff. I think that's all of them. The 5 quarterbacks Dak
got paid.
And Dak. Yeah, very last minute Dak. Those are the 6 quarterbacks that got their bag this offseason. Mm-hmm. And Jared Goff is the only one that actually looks like he deserves it. And before last night, I would have argued that he didn't look like he deserved it so far in the year. Mm-hmm. Like that's just it's been weird, like almost like uncanny the way that these quarterbacks that got these paydays have looked not good this year after getting it. Again, we're in the time of overreacting. We're 4 games into the season. But, like Trevor Lawrence certainly does not look like he was worth it. Tua Tagovailoa didn't really before he was hurt, and obviously now as the injury liability that he is doesn't look like he's worth it. Jordan Love, again, in the 2 games that he's played, hasn't looked very good. He hasn't looked bad. He hasn't looked Trevor Lawrence bad, but he hasn't looked great. Yes, he threw 4 touchdowns on Sunday, but he also threw 3 picks, Dak is weird. The Cowboys are weird. I don't even want to talk about them. They are in my failing expectations, but they're not even worth the time talking about. But yeah, it's just interesting, these quarterbacks and the way they're playing, considering they got all the money that they did this offseason.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I completely agree with you there that it looks really weird to see such high dollars and such low value coming out of it. Yeah. It's just really weird when we've seen Herbert and Burrow and other quarterbacks recently get paid and they play well. They struggle with injuries, but they play well. But these quarterbacks this last offseason, they got paid and nobody's playing anywhere close to an MVP level or top 10 level. Yeah. It's these quarterbacks being paid like they are and playing like they are, and seeing quarterbacks like Jaden Daniels and Sam Darnold and Justin Fields looking better than them is unacceptable for the NFL where we're at in 2024. There's no reason quarterbacks paid like top 5 quarterbacks should be getting outclassed by Baker Mayfield and Justin Fields and Jaden Daniels. There's no reason for that, but that's where we're at. And at the end of the season, that may not be where we're at, but that's where we're at now. So it's the only thing we have to chew on really right now.
Yeah. Yeah, last team that I want to talk about that is definitely behind the 8 ball when it comes to our expectations and their season so far is the San Francisco 49ers. They represented the NFC in the Super Bowl last year. They did not get worse. And in fact, I felt like they made some moves that made them a little bit better. Definitely, they got things worked out with Trent Williams, which was weird because he had already gotten paid. That wasn't like I'm on my last year holdout. But Brandon Ayuk, who got paid, but I don't think he's played in any games this year, or at least his stat line.
He's a 0 though. He just
No,
hasn't
I know
played well.
that was the joke
Yeah.
I was making.
Yes. He's the
like
tape's not kind to him though.
Yeah, they just don't look right. They are what are they, 2-2 right now, and they lost to Minnesota, who
manhandled them for the most part.
And Minnesota seems to be a formidable loss, but they lost to the Rams, who that's the Rams' only win this year. Like, granted,
it was Stafford and no one. It was Stafford to Atwell. It was no one.
Everyone's hurt. Cooper Kupp is hurt. Puka Nacua is hurt. So like, it's just, I mean, they always talk about, it's so much harder when you're the losing team in the Super Bowl to get back. But I didn't think that they were like, hey, actually, we might not win our division. We might lose it to the Seattle Seahawks. Like, and that's how they look right now. And that's crazy to me.
Mm-hmm. I think Brock Purdy, without all the Avengers, has actually overexceeded expectations without CMC this whole year. Debo obviously facing some injuries here and there. Ayuk not playing up to par. Kittle's been in and out with injuries. I've actually been somewhat impressed with them considering that. Their win-loss record and who they're losing against is a problem, and their defense not playing as good as it could is a problem. But Fred Warner's playing like a defensive player of the year. Brock Purdy's playing well. I think there are things to take solace in, but the record is not one of them. So
right.
That's where I'm at with them. I agree with you that they haven't looked as good as I thought they would, but there are reasons for it. They could be back in their 2020 season where everybody got hurt and they had a top 12 pick, but I don't think they're quite there yet. But with all the injuries mounting up, I don't know that they have that Super Bowl ceiling at this point. But they played all right considering it, I think. But all right isn't San Francisco standards.
Right. Yeah. I would apologize to all Christian McCaffrey fantasy owners out there, but you should have known better because he had a completely healthy year last year, which meant he was bound to be plagued by injuries this year. It's just kind of the story with him. So
yeah. And for a number one pick in fantasy, like if you're the number one pick in fantasy, you're set up for a disaster, it feels like half the time. So
yeah.
Happens that way.
It's life. That's life in fantasy.
Yes.
Football. But everybody, thank you so much for tuning in and for listening to us talk about the NFL after a little week hiatus. It used to be a quarter of the way through the year because we were 4 weeks through. Now it's, like one. I'm not even going to do the math. 2/9 of the way through the year. But yeah, thank you all so much for tuning in, for listening to us. And we hope you guys enjoyed. Have a great week, and we'll talk to you next week.
Yes, sir. Have a good day.